The train rattled and shook along the tracks, carrying the returning POWs back to the villages they had left behind years ago. Each man sitting silently staring through the narrow windows at the fields, forests, and rivers that were familiar, yet strangely altered by time and absence. The world outside seemed both the same and utterly different, and the men felt a tension in their chests, a mixture of anticipation, fear, and uncertainty that twisted like a knot deep inside them. They had been prisoners and survivors in a world defined by scarcity and strict rules, and now they were returning to freedom, yet unsure of what awaited them at the stations beyond. Carl pressed his hands against his knees, feeling the ache of months of labor and confinement. His eyes scanning the compartments, noting the faces of other men, some gaunt, others fuller, but all marked by the shadow of captivity. The clatter of the wheels on the rails seemed to echo the heartbeat of the returning soldiers, each vibration carrying with it memories of hunger, cold fear, and the endless counting of days that had passed between the barbed wire fences and watchful guards outside. Every thought haunted by the question of reception, and every glance toward the window tempered by hope. The train slowed as it approached the first station. The whistle sounded long and low, and the POWs instinctively straightened in their seats, their eyes meeting briefly and then darting away, some men rehearsing the words. They might speak to their families, others anticipating the recognition of neighbors or former friends, and some simply staring into space, trying to hold on to composure while the unknown weighed upon them heavily. The platform outside slowly filled with people, some carrying signs, others holding flowers and packages, and the men tried to read the faces for signs of welcome or judgment. As the doors opened, the first cries of reunion erupted, a mixture of joy, disbelief, and tears. Carl saw his younger brother among the crowd and felt a surge in his chest, yet also a tight knot of doubt. For years of absence had altered both the men and the world they returned to. There were moments of silence between embraces and hurried whispers as families struggled to comprehend the men who had left boys and returned men marked by the unspoken horrors of war. The intensity of the moment made every heartbeat a thunderclap and every glance a question yet to be answered, and Carl felt the weight of expectation pressing down upon him. The POWs moved carefully off the train, some leaning on canes or each other as the crowd surged around them. The scent of fresh bread and coal smoke mingled with the crisp air, carrying the unfamiliar comfort of normal life. Yet the tension in every returning prisoner remained palpable. The world outside the fences had changed while they had endured confinement. The laws of human behavior, the politics of the villages, and the eyes of families and neighbors now created a new landscape of uncertainty, and each step forward was measured for risk and perception. Carl approached his family cautiously, his mother reaching out with trembling hands, his father nodding gravely as if the weight of the years apart, and the knowledge of the war had altered the dynamics between them forever. The embrace was warm, yet tinged with a formality that startled him. He realized immediately that home was not the same, and that recognition of survival carried with it unspoken questions about morality choices and the unknown circumstances of captivity. The conversation was slow, careful words chosen for meaning and for safety. As they stepped back into the house, the familiar scent of wood and cooking filled the air, yet seemed both comforting and alien. Inside the rooms, the POWs shared stories cautiously. At first careful not to overwhelm or alarm families, yet unable to contain the experiences that had shaped them, every memory of hunger, forced labor, and the tense interactions with guards and other prisoners spilled into conversation with fragments and glimpses of emotion that startled listeners. The families listened intently, trying to reconcile the men before them with the tales of endurance and survival they could barely comprehend, and each revelation seemed to open a door to more questions than answers. The line between relief and shock blurred with every pause in speech and every glance exchanged. Neighbors arrived, slowly carrying gifts of food, clothing, and small gestures of welcome, yet their eyes betrayed curiosity, suspicion, and at times fear. Carl noticed how carefully he and the other returning POWs moved in the room, noting the small shifts in expression, the quiet exchange of glances, and the subtle ways the family absorbed information. They were not just being welcomed, they were being evaluated, and every word spoken, every gesture made, and every story told carried the weight of judgment and perception. At dinner, that evening, the family table was crowded and lively yet strange. The POWs noticed the cautious ways their parents and siblings passed food, how they measured questions and laughter, how each man and woman seemed to weigh reactions against what they thought had happened in the past years of absence. Carl watched closely, noting the subtle tension in posture, the quick glance at hands and forks, the way eyes flicked from one person to another, as if decoding messages in a language not spoken, and he realized that the ordinary act of sharing a meal had become a complex negotiation of trust, perception, and understanding. Late in the night, Carl sat by the window, gazing out at the moonlit fields, the quiet whisper of wind carrying memories of the camps and the forests and roads he had traversed during captivity. He felt a strange combination of relief and fear. The freedom of home contrasted sharply with the mental scars and vigilance that years of imprisonment had instilled. The stillness of the night held both comfort and threat, as he reflected on how the world he had returned to was both familiar and alien, and he sensed that the true challenges of reintegration had only just begun. Sleep came fitfully that night for many returning POWs. The memories of the camp and the sounds of freedom clashing with each other in vivid sequences. The ordinary sounds of doors closing, footsteps, and distant voices seemed amplified, carrying with them echoes of past threats and caution. The men lay awake, pondering the reactions of families and neighbors, how much to reveal, how much to conceal, how to balance the relief of survival with the responsibility of the stories they carried, and each moment of silence seemed pregnant with questions, yet unanswered. The following morning brought new challenges. The POWs were escorted through their villages, walking past familiar buildings altered by time and reconstruction, past neighbors, staring with mixed curiosity, relief, and suspicion. Every step forward a test of composure and perception. Carl observed carefully, noting who whispered, who smiled, who kept distance, each expression a cipher, a clue in the ongoing negotiation of belonging and acceptance. The ordinary streets were now laden with extraordinary implications for trust and judgment. School children paused in their tracks, staring at the returning men, some pointing, some whispering, others staring wide-eyed and questioning. The older POWs felt a strange mix of amusement, nostalgia, and caution, aware that the innocence of youth carried curiosity that could easily tip into fear or misunderstanding. Each encounter was fleeting, yet meaningful, and Carl cataloged every reaction, noting patterns and inconsistencies. The ordinary act of walking through a village had transformed into an intricate study of human response and perception. By mid-afternoon, small gatherings began spontaneously in homes and open courtyards, neighbors eager to learn from the men who had endured captivity. The POWs shared stories, carefully offering glimpses of experience while holding back details that might alarm or confuse the listeners. Yet the tension was constant, the awareness that words could carry consequence, the fear that an honest story might be misinterpreted, and the hope that knowledge could bridge gaps and heal wounds created a delicate balance. Every word spoken carried weight, every gesture watched and remembered, and every silence amplified. Evening fell with a strange calm, the air filled with the sense of cooking wood smoke and the faint chill of approaching night. The returning POWs reflected on the complexity of reintegration. The ordinary tasks of living, walking, speaking, eating had become laden with meaning and potential risk. each man aware that survival had not ended at the train station. The lessons of captivity carried forward into this new landscape where judgment, observation, and subtle understanding determined acceptance and belonging, and each heartbeat carried the knowledge that the past and present now collided in profound ways. And as Carl lay in his childhood bed staring at the ceiling, shadows stretching across familiar walls, he understood that the journey had only begun, that the true test of endurance and adaptation would unfold in the days and months ahead, and that the ordinary world of home and family was now a terrain of observation, strategy, and emotional negotiation where the POWs would need all the skills honed during captivity to navigate the complex terrain of trust and expectation. The morning sun crept slowly over the rooftops and cast long, pale shadows across the village streets. Carl stepped outside with other returning POWs. The air smelled of damp earth wood smoke and freshly baked bread, yet beneath the ordinary scents lingered the weight of anticipation and fear. The villagers stared silently, some nodding tentatively, others crossing themselves or whispering prayers. The men moved cautiously, their eyes alert, scanning faces, gestures, and postures for signs of welcome or suspicion. The ordinary act of walking past neighbors had transformed into a subtle battlefield of perception and judgment. Children ran along the cobblestones, laughing yet pausing to stare at the returning men, their innocence curious yet fragile, a reminder that life had continued despite war and imprisonment. Carl smiled faintly and waved, yet the gesture was measured, cautious. He knew that even simple friendliness could be misread as arrogance or insolence, and each interaction required careful calculation, observation, and timing. The ordinary had become extraordinary, and every small gesture carried consequences that extended far beyond the moment as the day progressed. Small groups of villagers began to approach the POWs, asking questions cautiously, each word chosen carefully, eyes flicking nervously from one listener to another, some seeking news of missing relatives, some testing the men for loyalty or alignment, each answer measured for accuracy, yet also for safety and prudence. Carl noticed the subtle dynamics evolving, the villagers attempting to assert control, the returning men testing the waters of acceptance and trust, and the unspoken understanding that one misstep could reverberate far beyond the immediate exchange. The ordinary conversation had become a delicate negotiation of identity and credibility. In the town square, a small gathering formed around the returning POWs as elders inquired about conditions in captivity. The men offered fragments of memory-controlled stories of survival and observation, leaving out the harshest cruelties yet hinting at suffering and endurance. The villagers listened intently, absorbing every detail while quietly evaluating each narrative against their own assumptions. And fears, the air was thick with anticipation, as each word spoken carried weight and meaning, and every pause filled with the tension of unspoken questions and unseen judgments. The ordinary recounting of days in captivity had become a performance of trust, diplomacy, and caution. Carl and Dieter moved among the crowd, noting reactions, gestures, and expressions. The villagers glanced at one another, whispering comments under their breath, some nodding approval, others shaking heads in doubt. Returning POWs began to sense patterns of perception, trustworthiness, and suspicion forming silently around them. Every interaction a test of composure, every glance a puzzle to decode the ordinary movements of daily life, had been replaced by heightened awareness and anticipation of consequences both immediate and far-reaching. The complexity of the village social network now rivaled any challenge faced during imprisonment. By midday, families had gathered in homes offering food and small tokens of welcome. Yet each gift was accompanied by cautious observation. The men accepted carefully, noting who lingered, who glanced nervously, who whispered to neighbors. Every act of giving was scrutinized and cataloged, every expression analyzed for intent. Carl realized that the ordinary acts of hospitality had become a multi-layered examination of loyalty perception and reconciliation, the past and present colliding in ways that demanded vigilance, intelligence, and emotional control every meal shared. Every hand shaken, every word spoken was loaded with potential consequence and risk. Later in the afternoon, a messenger arrived from a neighboring village bearing news of other returning POWs, stories of hardship and survival whispered from house. To house the information carried both relief and tension. The men compared notes, verifying accounts, silently acknowledging coincidences and discrepancies, noting the ways rumors shaped expectation and perception. The ordinary act of exchanging information had evolved into a careful negotiation of truth, credibility, and social alignment. Each narrative tested patience, observation, and judgment, as if the world outside the barracks had become a live laboratory for survival and adaptation. Carl noticed that some villagers brought small gestures of suspicion, cloaked as generosity. A loaf of bread carried hesitantly, a piece of cloth offered with a glance toward neighbors as if seeking approval. These nuances did not escape the POWs, their eyes sharp. From months of captivity scanning for intent, each act cataloged for future reference, every subtlety analyzed for meaning, the ordinary acts of giving and receiving had been transformed into a complex system of observation and assessment, where trust was measured silently and patience tested with each interaction. The villagers themselves were unwitting participants in a game of perception and influence. As evening approached, Carl and the other POWs were invited to attend a gathering at the local inn. The room was crowded with villagers, friends, and family, seated at long tables filled with simple fare. Yet the air was heavy with anticipation, curiosity, and restrained excitement. The returning men moved among them, greeting quietly, observing, listening carefully, noting the subtle cues of expression, posture, and tone. Every conversation layered with potential for misunderstanding, insight, or revelation. The ordinary social gathering had become an exercise in psychological navigation. Every gesture, every smile, every glance was potentially meaningful, and every silence pregnant with interpretation. During the gathering, a young man asked a question about conditions in captivity. Carl responded cautiously, selecting words to convey endurance and humanity. Without alarming or shocking the listeners, he noted immediately the ripple of reactions, some nodding approval, others frowning doubt. Yet even as he spoke, he observed the subtle exchange of glances between villagers and family, members a silent dialogue of perception, trust, and calculation. Every word, a test, every answer, an opportunity to build credibility or provoke suspicion. The ordinary act of conversation had become a minefield of perception where knowledge could heal or harm. Night descended on the village, and the POWs were escorted back to their former homes. The streets were quiet, the shadows long, and the faint wind carrying the scent of smoke and earth. Carl felt the tension of the day lingering, a sense of both relief and apprehension. He understood that survival was not only a matter of physical endurance, but also of social perception, emotional control, and the careful navigation of trust and expectation. The ordinary world outside the barbed wire fences had become an intricate puzzle, each piece potentially loaded with consequence. Inside his childhood home, Carl lay awake, listening to the creaks of the floorboards, the distant calls of neighbors, and the faint whisper of wind through the eaves. He reflected on the events of the day. The careful observation required, the subtle judgments passed silently by friends and strangers alike, and the extraordinary consequences of ordinary interactions. The memories of captivity lingered. In parallel with the new challenges of reintegration, every sound, every movement, and every gesture carried weight and significance far beyond the men and women involved. The following morning dawned clear and bright. The returning POWs walked to the village square, once again greeted by neighbors and curious strangers. The ordinary routines of life had resumed, yet every interaction carried the residue of past experiences. The men moved cautiously, their eyes scanning for signs of trust, suspicion. Approval or doubt, every step measured for consequence, every word selected for meaning. The ordinary day had become a complex choreography of observation, understanding, and strategy as the POWs navigated the intricate landscape of reintegration. In recognition, Carl noticed the younger POWs struggling with small interactions, a smile too broad, a gesture too quick, a response too delayed, each nuance interpreted by villagers as potential threat or reassurance, guidance or defiance. The men whispered advice to one another, passing along observations and insights, quietly sharing lessons of patience, timing, and perception. The ordinary act of socialization had become an exercise in subtle strategy and survival awareness, where the consequences of misinterpretation could ripple across the village in unpredictable ways. By midday, a small crowd gathered in the town hall for a formal meeting where the mayor and elders sought to hear first-hand accounts of captivity and survival. The POWs spoke, carefully choosing words to convey endurance and humanity without alarming or shocking the audience. Yet even as they spoke, every subtle reaction, every glance, every shift in posture and expression was noted by Carl and the others. A silent ledger of trust, credibility, and influence was compiled in real time, each ordinary act of listening and speaking transformed into extraordinary measures of social navigation and awareness. Afternoon faded into evening, and the POWs returned to homes with families still processing the events of the day. The ordinary acts of sitting together, sharing food and conversation, had become profound exercises in observation and understanding, every gesture measured, every word weighted, and every glance interpreted. The men recognized that reintegration required not only endurance of body, but endurance of perception, patience, and strategy. The lessons learned during captivity now applied to the terrain of home and society with intensity and consequence. Night fell again, the village silent except for distant barking dogs and the occasional call of a bird in the eaves. Carl lay awake, reflecting on the challenges of the past 2 days. The sun rose pale and weak over the village. Carl stepped outside and felt a strange tension in the air, as though the previous days of cautious greetings, whispers, and observations had crystallized into something heavier, something tangible. The streets were lined with familiar buildings, yet the men knew that each face watching them carried questions and judgments long unspoken. The ordinary walk to the town square felt like an entrance onto a stage where every gesture, every glance could shift perception, and every word could ignite reaction. As Carl moved through the crowd, he noticed subtle changes. Whispers had grown bolder, questions sharper, and children stared longer, their innocence tempered by the weight of curiosity and rumor. The returning POWs felt the intensity of scrutiny like a tangible pressure. The villagers observing carefully, cataloging behavior, calculating intent. The ordinary act of walking past neighbors had become a test of composure and intelligence. Each step measured, each movement, a potential revelation of character or hidden motive. At the square, the mayor called the gathering to order. A rare mix of anticipation and tension filled the air. Villagers leaning forward, eyes bright with curiosity and some with fear as the returning men spoke the narratives of captivity, unfolded carefully controlled words describing endurance work, hunger, cold, fear, and the quiet observation of guards and fellow prisoners. Yet even as they spoke, the reactions were unpredictable. Some nodding in approval, others whispering doubt, and Carl realized immediately that perception could not be fully managed. The ordinary recounting of experience had become a performance of strategy, judgment, and diplomacy. A voice rose from the back, a neighbor demanding details of events that had been deliberately omitted. The question pierced the careful control the men had maintained, and for a moment, silence hung thick, the room holding its collective breath. Carl noticed the tension in every face, the subtle shift of posture, the sharpening of eyes, the quiet tightening of fists, and he understood that the ordinary act of questioning had become a weapon, and that every response carried consequences far beyond the immediate conversation. The past years of captivity and survival had prepared them for observation and restraint, but not for the unpredictable currents of social expectation. Carl spoke cautiously, choosing each word with precision, describing survival, endurance, and quiet humanity without revealing cruelty that might shock or provoke fear. Yet his eyes scanned constantly, noting reactions and micro-expressions, subtle cues of approval, skepticism, and suspicion. The villagers cataloged and compared, silently recording the balance of honesty, perception, and trust in each statement. Every ordinary word had become a test, every gesture a negotiation, and every silence a potential minefield of interpretation. The ordinary conversation had become extraordinary in its stakes and implications. As the afternoon deepened, whispers spread rapidly among the crowd, fragments of conversation, carrying stories half remembered, and rumors begun during captivity, now warped and reshaped by perception. Carl felt the pull of tension between truth and expectation. The ordinary act of sharing knowledge had become dangerous territory, each revelation carrying weight, each omission potentially explosive, and every reaction a puzzle of human psychology requiring vigilance and careful navigation. The returning POWs understood that their words could heal or harm, shape trust or provoke suspicion, and every interaction was measured in real time. At the village bakery, a small confrontation arose when a man accused one of the returning POWs of collaboration during captivity. The accusation, sharp and sudden, like a knife cutting through the tentative calm. The room froze. Carl saw the POWs stiffen, the villagers leaning forward, eyes wide in anticipation. The ordinary accusation had become a catalyst for suspicion and fear. The weight of unspoken histories colliding with current observation and the subtle art of reintegration now tested in full force, the atmosphere thick with tension, anticipation, and the quiet hum of judgment. Carl intervened carefully, choosing words that acknowledged the fear and suspicion without inflaming it, describing endurance, choices made under duress, and the complexity of human behavior under extreme conditions. Yet even as he spoke, eyes narrowed, the villagers weighing every syllable, measuring credibility and intent. The ordinary act of defending oneself had become a performance requiring psychological precision, every word a potential bridge or barrier, and every pause a field of interpretation where trust and doubt mingled dangerously. By evening, the village square had emptied slowly, but the tension lingered. Like smoke in the air, the returning POWs walked home, noting the lingering stares and whispered comments as they moved through familiar yet charged streets. The ordinary act of returning home had become a subtle negotiation of trust, influence, and perception. Every familiar building, every street corner, every neighbor's glance now loaded with potential for revelation, judgment, or reconciliation. The past and present collided in the quiet streets, and Carl felt the weight of observation pressing upon him in ways he had not anticipated. At home, the family gathered for a modest supper conversation, careful but charged the ordinary gestures of pouring water, passing bread now weighed with significance, each glance and nod catalogued by the returning POWs and the family alike. Carl observed closely, noting hesitation in speech, subtle tightening of shoulders, the rapid flicker of eyes seeking approval or reassurance. Every meal a study in human perception and the delicate balance between welcome and scrutiny. The ordinary act of eating had transformed into an intricate psychological test of endurance, patience, and insight. Later in the night, Carl sat alone by the window, the wind whispering through the trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. He reflected on the encounters of the day, each exchange catalogued in his mind. Every glance analyzed, every word parsed for subtlety, meaning, and intent. He realized that survival had shifted from physical endurance to the complex arena of social navigation, perception, and psychological subtlety. The ordinary acts of listening, speaking, and observing now carried extraordinary consequence. He thought of the letters some of the POWs had written before returning home, recounting events cautiously to families hoping for understanding. Yet now he understood that even letters carried weight. They shaped perception and expectation, creating tensions invisible yet potent. Each word potentially confirming fear or hope bridging, trust or igniting doubt. The ordinary act of writing had become a tool of survival and reconciliation, each sentence a negotiation with the unknown response of family and community. In the quiet hours, the village seemed asleep, yet the tension lingered. Invisible threads of anticipation stretching across streets, homes, and fields. Carl could sense it in the air the way shadows fell differently. The faint creak of doors and the rustle of leaves seemed amplified by perception and history. The ordinary. Night had become charged with the weight of memory, observation, and anticipation. Every sound, a reminder that reintegration was not a moment, but a process. A subtle game of endurance awareness and subtle diplomacy. The following morning, Carl walked through the marketplace, vendors cautiously observing the returning POWs as they purchased food goods and supplies. The ordinary transactions now laden with scrutiny, subtle glances between customers and sellers. Every interaction cataloged and analyzed. The men navigated this landscape carefully, noting hesitation in smiles, subtle adjustments of tone and posture. Every gesture examined for signs of trust or judgment. The ordinary act of buying and selling had become a performance in observation, diplomacy, and psychological endurance, as news of the POW's return spread to neighboring villages. Curiosity heightened tension and expectation, each messenger carrying fragments of stories, whispers, and questions, the ordinary act of communication, transformed into a network of perception, anticipation, and subtle influence. Each message shaping opinion and behavior far beyond its immediate audience. Carl understood that the ordinary world had become a landscape of observation, calculation, and psychological strategy where survival required constant vigilance, awareness, and careful control of words and gestures. By midday, a formal gathering was arranged at the village hall to discuss reintegration and aid for returning POWs. The room filled. With villagers, friends, and family, the ordinary space now charged with tension, anticipation, and subtle observation. The POWs moved cautiously, their words measured and eyes alert, noting the reactions of everyone present, each nod, frown, or whisper. Cataloged for meaning, every interaction, a test, and every pause a potential minefield. The ordinary act of speaking and listening had become extraordinary in consequence and risk. During the gathering, a former friend of Carl's from the village approached him asking pointed questions about choices made in captivity. The inquiry sharp and loaded with implication, the men responded carefully, describing endurance, humanity, and survival under duress, yet every word was analyzed by listeners. Every pause interpreted, every subtle gesture examined and compared. The ordinary act of explaining past actions had become a delicate negotiation of credibility, trust, and perception. Every sentence, a potential bridge or source of tension. Every expression, a subtle signal of alignment or skepticism as the afternoon faded. Carl and the other returning POWs walked through fields, once familiar yet altered by time and the war. The ordinary landscapes now carried the weight of memory, endurance, and reflection, each tree stone and path a reminder of past.